Hello everybody. This is going to be a quick overview of how turbochargers work in automation, and we're going to go a little bit into how to tune them as well, but most of that will be covered in another video. This one is specifically to illustrate what you should be tuning on a turbocharger to give certain varying degrees of performance and fuel efficiency, rather than what values you should be looking at for certain vehicle types. So right off the bat, what a turbocharger does is uses the exhaust gases and a system of compressors and turbines in order to force higher pressure air into the cylinder and allowing you to use more fuel in order to combust and create more power at potentially higher efficiencies. So let's get right into it. We'll make a fairly basic engine first. We'll just get standard, cast iron block. Make it 1.7 liter, and we'll just do a single cam 2 valve per cylinder. So it's a very simple engine design because we're not really worried about that right now. So we'll just put normal pistons in it, don't need to worry about VVT, and we'll do direct injection and put a cat and everything on it. So here we are. We've got our basic engine. It's putting out 100 horsepower right now, and we're going to add a turbocharger. So when you add a turbocharger, I'm sure you guys have noticed what's going to happen here is your octane value is going to increase. You're not going to be able to run at the same high level of compression with a turbocharger that you can in a naturally aspirated engine, which is important to note because you don't really need it. You don't need that level of compression because your cylinder, the air inside it, is already being compressed more by the higher pressure being put out by the turbocharger. In general, you should be using a ball bearing instead of a journal bearing whenever it's available. It's not available in all years that the turbocharger is. I believe it starts in the late 80s or the 90s that you can use these. But always do when you can. It's just more efficient, and it doesn't really cost that much more. You might consider a journal bearing if you're making a very small eco car because it is cheaper, but again, you're not going to get the same efficiency or power output. So let's look right at the settings here. I recommend always starting out with some sort of preset when you're going to make your turbocharger. It just makes your life a little bit easier because everything's already set to similar values that you're going to be looking at. But we're not going to be too worried about that. So we'll just click on performance right now, and you can see the larger turbocharger and the larger pressure is causing our engine to knock. So we're going to lower our compression to about 9. First off, we've got our intercooler setting. So your engine needs a certain amount of cooling in order to stay reliable, and if it starts to overheat, you're not going to be able to get as much power out of it because your engine is starting to fail. But you also don't want too big an intercooler because that'll sap your engine's power. So the easiest way to tune your intercooler is to just move the slider around till your performance is right where you want it. And increasing the intercooler size will increase your octane value. So, the more powerful your turbocharger setup is, the less compression you're going to be able to use, even independent of these values. You don't want your intercooler to be really anywhere else than the highest performance value. A smaller intercooler doesn't mean you get better fuel efficiency. It does mean it's a little bit easier to cool, but if you're running into cooling issues, you're probably just using too large a turbo setup. So we'll look at the compressor now. The compressor is the first component that your air is going to run into coming out of the exhaust. And what's happening with the compressor is it's, like it implies, compressing all of the air so that it's more dense and it can have more fuel inside the same combustion chamber. So a larger compressor will allow for more more air to be compressed and then more fuel, but it's not necessarily the best option because the larger your compressor is, the more you're going to need to spool it up or sorry, not the more you're going to need to spool it up, but the more time it'll take to compress your air if you don't have any pressure in it, the system. So, a smaller compressor is good for a fuel economy minded engine because it means your turbocharger will kick in quickly and it won't kick in so hard. But a larger compressor is better to drive a larger turbine. Now your turbine is the biggest factor really in your, I'd say, the handling of your turbocharged car. It's not the biggest factor in performance, that's likely the boost, but the turbine will change a lot of things here. As I increase or decrease the turbine, you could see, if you take a look at the torque graph, which is the one you're going to be wanting to look at when you're tuning turbocharger, because RPM is just a function of torque over time. If you look at the torque graph, as you increase the turbocharger size, your torque curve that goes steeply when the turbo kicks in later. And the later it kicks in, the more lag your turbo is going to have when you're upshifting. That's really important to note, because it means if you're upshifting at a lower RPM, your power will be drastically different than if you're upshifting at a higher RPM here, where your turbo's already kicked in. So, it's usually better to keep a reasonable turbine size. And another important reason for that is if your turbine is so big and your torque curve so steep, even the smallest upshift can result in a massive torque jump really quickly, and it can cause your car to uncontrollably spin out. But we're talking really high power levels, like up to 400 horsepower per liter, 300 horsepower per liter, really up there. You'll see it a lot if you're messing around with turbochargers on your own time and just trying to make the most powerful car. The moment you put that in BeamNG drive, it's probably going to spin out before you reach third gear. So, how can you counter that? How can you counter not only turbine lag, but the fact that you're just sending too much torque to the wheels? And you can't control it necessarily in the turbocharger menu here, but you can control it by using different drive types. If you have all-wheel drive, then your wheels might not start spinning if you're getting such a high torque jump, so that can help a little bit. Limited slip differentials are also a good idea. They'll keep everything running steady, but there's only so much you can do. So do be really careful of this, and later on we'll go into a video about tuning in particular, and I'll show you what kind of values and torque graphs you should be looking at in a good high-performance engine. Next we're going to look at AR ratio. So your AR ratio is just the aspect ratio of your turbine. So how high it is versus how wide it is. To put it simply, because you really don't need an in-depth explanation for automation's very simplified turbocharger design, increasing your AR ratio will, as it says, give better turbo performance at high RPM. A smaller one will give better turbo performance at low RPM. So what does that mean really? What it means is it's going to change your torque curve right there, and it's also going to change where your peak power is at. So this is the only circumstance in which you're really looking at your peak power as well. It's really important to have a high RPM power in, a sports car, something where you're going to be upshifting at high RPMs a lot. But it's going to make it worse as a normal sedan or an economy-minded car, because you're not getting that low-end torque that's good at preventing stalls, accelerating quickly from a stop. You'll notice with a turbocharged car when you're accelerating from a stop, because you have such little power at the low end with a big turbo, you're not going to accelerate as quickly until you reach 3,000 or 4,000 RPM for a supercar, 2,500 to 3 on a sports sedan or something. So, finally, we've got our max boost, and what that really is it's just measured in bar, kilopascals, or PSI, the amount of pressure that you're shoving out of the whole assembly. So, your max boost can generally be as low as, even like 0.3 or so. That's perfect for if you just want a steady torque curve. If you can get these compressor and turbines set up properly, you'll have an absolutely beautiful torque curve, and it won't increase performance. It might even decrease it, but it makes the ride a lot smoother, so you could consider that for a luxury car. When you get to around 5 or so, that's a good starting value for fuel economy. You could go as high as 6 and as low as 4 if you're just looking for an efficient engine. When you approach 8 or 9, you're getting into some performance, so think a hot hatch like a Focus ST, Golf GTI, something like that. And realistically, you can output probably 1.4 bar without running into some serious difficulties in tuning it. And of course, as you increase the boost, you increase the pressure, and you change your octane value. Everything here really affects the octane value in some way. Increasing turbine and compressor size will change the octane value sometimes. Usually, on a smaller engine and turbocharger, it's not such a big deal. But when you're working with huge setups, then it does change it significantly. So just keep an eye on that. It doesn't change linearly either. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. Very important to keep a lookout for that. Now, when you're increasing the amount of pressure in your cylinder, that means you can draw more air in, but that air isn't going to do much if you can't put more fuel in it too. So, instead of running at 15 to 1 fuel mixture for an economy car, 14.7, 14.2, you might want to consider, going even as far as 13 for a sportier car. You'll still get reasonable fuel economy, but you'll be able to get a lot more out of a smaller turbo size. So it's very important to think about that. Your ignition timing, you're going to want pretty advanced as well on a turbocharger setup. That's just going to help you at the higher RPMs, which you're likely going to be experiencing when you're running a turbo setup. Another thing to watch out for, if we, let's say, go to race here, is the bigger... Here, let's put some more pressure in it. We'll go as high as 1.6, and we'll really shove as much fuel as we can in here. You can make it a lot richer with a turbocharger setup once again than a naturally aspirated one without starting to lose power, because you're basically flooding the engine at a certain point. Just because of the higher pressure, more air, more fuel. That's what turbochargers are about. So, we've got as much fuel in there as we can. We're going to set it to race, ultimate. We'll make this thing really shoving out at high RPMs. And what'll make that easier actually for us is switching to a V engine setup or a boxer setup, because any sort of V or boxer engine gets 2 turbochargers. Very easy way to increase power without increasing turbo lag, because you've got 2 turbochargers. And they're not running sequentially, they're running in tandem with each other. It's not like an RX-7, it's not like a couple of the twin turbo diesel engines where one is operating at a different RPM than the other. They're operating at the same time. So you get less turbo lag with a twin charged setup, a bi-turbo setup. So, that's a really good idea for performance, maybe not such a good idea for an economy car, where you're looking at getting a small, tiny turbo to increase efficiency. So keep that in mind if you're going for a 6-cylinder economy-minded version. You should probably be using an inline 6 unless you've already developed a V engine to work off of. So, you can see, we'll just increase that here, you can see there's a massive jump at the very high RPM, and this here is just a very mediocre torque curve. This is what happens a lot when you see newer people tuning cars on the automation subreddit. And while the power value can look pretty impressive for what you're doing, it's not really all that useful to you. You can't utilize that power properly because your torque curve isn't where it needs to be. Look at how steep it falls off. Look at how steep it goes up. What's going to happen is you're going to drive, and you're flooring it in first gear, and then you get so much torque without even shifting gears that your car is going to start to lose traction. And this is going to be a really, really important point to note when you're coming out of a corner. Coming out of a corner, you want consistent torque. You want a consistent torque curve, and this is the furthest you can come from it. So that pretty much covers the basics of turbochargers and automation. All V engines and boxer engines use a twin turbo setup. All inline engines use a single turbo. There's no way to change that as of yet in automation, but hopefully that's a feature that we get in the future, because a lot of engines, for instance the Subaru WRX Boxer 4, is a boxer engine with a single turbo. I believe BMW makes twin turbo inline 6s, so it's not necessarily realistic in that manner, but the turbochargers in this game aren't exactly realistic for a modern car either. These are more accurate to something you'd see in the 70s, something you'd see in the 80s, really early days of turbocharging technology in your average car. So, I hope that you guys liked my little overview of how turbochargers work in automation, and it's not necessarily completely accurate to real life, but it's how the game simulates it. We'll be covering shortly in another video what the best values are to be tuning for, what it means as far as performance is concerned, how your torque curves should be looking, but that's for another day. This should give you a good idea of what you're doing and what the values you're changing actually give you, which is really good. The best way to learn in this game is to figure out what the values do for yourself instead of going off of, values from previous cars you've made or anything like that. That's how you get high power, high efficiency, and brilliant performance out of your cars. So, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and have a good day.